John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta had their 2025 scouting combine press conferences on Tuesday, and it left some people in doubt about Mark Andrews' future with the team. Justin Tucker was addressed, and Ronnie Stanley, he appears poised to come back. We'll talk about all that and more coming up next on Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher of Ravens Wire, here with you on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here and making Locked On Ravens a part of your day, your first listen each and every day as well. We're free and available for you on all podcasting platforms, including in video form on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe to the channel, and in audio form where you can follow along and subscribe as well. 5 days a week plus more of daily Ravens coverage. And that includes during the offseason. I know a little bit of a lull period right now as we wait for free agency, but we heard John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta speak at the combine, and a future really for the Ravens where some players might be there and some players might not be there, historic members of the team. And here to talk about that more with me, it is Brian McFarland, Ravens salary cap, Russell Street Report. Brian, I'm really glad to have you back on. And I think the timing couldn't be better because I know a lot of people are wondering about players like Mark Andrews, players like Ronnie Stanley, even a Justin Tucker, what those situations look like. And with the salary cap increase, it could be a nice offseason for the Ravens, but might not be a splashy one.
Yeah, I think that's rarely are they splashy, obviously. It's generally about retaining their own. It sounded like some good news there about Stanley, which was a little different from the prior press conference back in January, which he didn't say a whole lot. He doesn't get generally very open about things, but this was a little over the top open almost. So, but yeah, it's the salary cap's a puzzle, and it's trying to fit the pieces together, and the team's going to have plans A, B, C, D, and F. Hopefully, they don't have to get that far down, but yeah, so I mean they're poised. We'll see over the next couple of weeks is going to be the time they're going to have to create cap space. So we're going to learn of cuts and extensions and restructures, and so it's once we get next week will be March 3rd, and that'll be basically just a little over a week out from free agency. So actually that'll be a week from the tampering period, the legal tampering period. So things are going to start, not just with the Ravens, but around the league. Things are going to start heating up pretty quick here.
Yeah, and for the Ravens, they're not the team that necessarily dips their hand in full force on the first couple days. I mean, they did that technically a couple years ago with Marcus Williams, Morgan Moses, and Zadarius Smith the second time before that all fell apart. But that's rare for, I think, the Ravens to do, where we usually see them. Maybe they'll sign a guy on day 2. They did that with Derrick Henry last offseason, but they like to wait. But I think the difference this offseason, Brian, compared to maybe the last handful, is that the Ravens don't have that laundry list of free agents that they have to look to re-sign. And with that comes, well, you're not going to be able to keep everybody. We certainly saw that last offseason. And before we get into Mark Andrews, I think that's a really intriguing conversation. Baltimore's overall cap picture right now in your eyes. With the increase in cap, we know that range is a little bit higher than projected for most people. Do you think Baltimore is in a good cap spot right now? Are they fine? Or do you think it's not great and they're going to have to really look to that restructure tool and that extension tool to free up a lot of space so they can operate?
Yeah, I mean, they're not in great shape. They do technically right now. And again, it's always just a snapshot at this time of the year. It could change, 2 hours from now. But they're about 12 and a half over the cap. I'm sorry, under the cap, which sounds great. But they still have to figure out Darius Washington's restricted free agent tender. There's going to be some cap adjustments for all of the incentives that were earned last year. That's going to be a negative number. So really, they're not at this point. They're just going to be a couple million once that's done, and that kind of the starting point. That puts them just really a couple million under the cap. So obviously, that's not enough, not only for free agency, re-signing guys like Stanley or Patrick Ricard, guys like that, but also just I try to caution people when you hear, oh, that means we have 12 million to spend. Well, they have future expenses as well, which I think the team's mindful of, but fans need to be mindful of too. You got to fill out your practice squad when it comes to September. That's going to be $4 to $5 million by itself. You're going to have guys that are going to be hurt. So you're going to be carrying guys on injured reserve count and their replacements count. So there's a lot of those things. And obviously the draft picks, once they draft 11 picks, not a lot of high picks. So, it's not a huge number, but that's going to weigh in as well. So, those kind of expenses are probably 15 to 16 million by themselves. So if you want to look at it that way, they're over the cap right now when you factor those future expenses in. So, so they have options, restructures and extensions, cuts. We'll get into Andrews, I guess, in a second, but they have options, but their season or their off season really comes down to about 6 contracts, to be honest with you, because there's not a lot of guys to be cut. There's not really a lot of guys to be restructured. So that's Lamar is one. Andrews is the other, or one of the others. Marlon, Humphrey. So Lamar and Humphrey would be extension ideally, but if you can't reach an extension, it's going to have to be a restructure. Roquan Smith would be a restructure. Andrews is going to be a release or trade or extension, maybe. Sounds like that's the least likely at this point. And Roquan Smith, did I say Roquan Smith already? Yeah, so he's a restructure. Owe would be an extension. There's substantial amount of savings there if he was extended. And Derrick Henry. So that's the 6. Usually we have a bunch of different, kind of options. What are they going to do? But it really comes down to those 6. And ideally extensions for Henry, Lamar, Humphrey, Owe. That's a lot to do between now and, in 2 weeks, basically. And they don't have to get it all done in 2 weeks, obviously. But that's really what they're looking at this offseason.
Yeah, and I think that people do underrate the fact that, you do have to give guys on the practice squad a part of your cap. And obviously the draft picks do factor into that as well. And with 11, like you said, that's going to continue to add up if they don't trade away any of those picks, and they maybe even could add a pick because of the Mark Andrews situation. And Eric DeCosta was asked about Mark Andrews, John Harbaugh and DeCosta speaking at the Combine on Tuesday. And a lot of people are kind of wondering, well, based off his answer, what does the future for Mark Andrews actually hold? He said, quote, "He'll be in the Ring of Honor someday. We'll figure out all the roster machinations over the coming weeks, but there's no bigger Mark Andrews fan than me. He's been a blessing to have on the team." Now, he didn't outright say, hey, we're getting rid of Mark or trading him. This is kind of like an in limbo thing of he could definitely stay. You could go the restructure / extension route, or you could move off of him, save the $11 million in cap space. You could outright just cut him if you wanted to, or you could trade him for draft capital. Andrews still has value. So I feel like if you're going to move off of him, a trade is probably the best option. There'd be teams probably lining up out the door. But in your estimation, Brian, with what we saw from Mark Andrews, with the cap hit number of 16.9 and the savings that he could bring, plus we know Isaiah Likely is waiting in the wings to break out as that tight end 1 if Andrews is not back. Do you think it's the right thing to do for the Ravens to keep Andrews on the roster for one more year? Because I assume they're going to have to choose next year between Andrews and Likely. I don't think he can keep both of those guys.
Yeah, I think this is the offseason to figure it out. Because it is, as you said, $11 million in savings there, which is not insubstantial in any way, shape, or form. DeCosta was not, he never at any point said, we want to have Mark back. He never said anything like that. Now, that could be a negotiating tactic with Andrews and Andrews' agent. We're not gonna come out and say we absolutely want you back, because that makes the negotiation harder on us. We need some concessions from you, and so I'm not totally saying that's out of the possibility. But if you re-sign Andrews, you probably lose Likely. And obviously there's a 5-year difference in age there, which is pretty substantial. And obviously Andrews, other than the playoffs, played very well. And got a slow start, but he was coming off of injury, and then he had the automobile accident. So trading him, I think, is probably the most likely outcome. I've seen a lot of, we're going to 2nd round or 3rd round pick for him. I don't see that. They'll be, honestly, in my opinion, lucky to get a fourth. That's just the way trades go. He's only because the team that acquires him is going to have to deal with the 11 million and extend him because they don't want him just as a one. They're not going to want him as just a 1-year rental. Or they say that, well, we're not going to extend him. We're only looking at a 1-year rental, which some teams might. So that might only be a fifth or sixth in their mind. So it obviously depends on what's out there. But I do think that that's probably the most likely outcome. I don't think releasing him. I mean, obviously, if they don't get any kind of offers, if teams think they're going to release him, and we'll just make a play for him when it's free agency because we don't like that 11 million as the starting point, which is understandable from a negotiating tactic.
Yeah.
So we'll see. But I mean, I think trade is the most likely. Him being back on some sort of modified deal, whether it's an extension or some sort of extension. I think that's the second. Release is probably staying on the 11 million is probably the third, and release is probably the fourth. But those two could be third or fourth.
For Andrews, he's a guy that still has so much value to the Ravens. It's not like getting rid of him. It's just like, oh, okay, see you later. You didn't mean anything and you haven't done. No, Andrews has been a really important part of this team. He's been a focal point of the offense. He and Lamar Jackson, that chemistry does not grow overnight or on trees. And while Lamar likely have their own set of that, Mark and Lamar, came in the league together, and Isaiah's just had less time with Lamar. That's just the fact of it all. There's a lot of conversation about that trade package, and you said, okay, well, maybe not a second, maybe not a third, maybe even not a fourth, but with 11 draft picks, do you think it's possible the Ravens could package a couple of their mid-tier picks? Maybe could this be a draft day situation even where they don't use that cap space up immediately during the March, April portion, and then on draft night, they have a guy they really like, and they know that, hey, this is a tight end needy team. Let's trade Mark Andrews, get a couple of those mid-round picks, and maybe try to move up.
That would be unlikely because he does have a $4 million roster bonus due about a week after, 5 days to 7 days after the start of the new league year. So once they get to it, I would think if they're going to release him or trade him, that's kind of that drop dead date. Because then if you pay him, one, you're paying the $4 million and then you get rid of him later. And two, then your cap savings is only $7 million if you do that. So I think that's probably unlikely. It certainly makes some sense, but I think that trigger, and that's why players in the later years of their contracts, that's why agents and players want that roster bonus there, so you don't get strung out till June and say, okay, well, we're going to cut you now, and now all the free agent money is dried up. So a lot of Humphrey's contract has that, Roquan Smith's has that, a lot of contracts have that in those latter years. Doesn't change the money any, doesn't change the cap number any, but it does force the team to fish or cut bait as early as possible.
Right. And for those watching or listening, this is why we have Brian here, to get every single nuance of the cap. And I think, Brian, it's exactly what happened with obviously guys like Kevin Zeitler last year. They have some bonus guaranteed by a certain date. And obviously, if you don't pay that bonus out, then obviously it's not very likely the guy returns. For Andrews, if you do pay him the roster bonus, like you said, it feels kind of redundant to pay him the $4 million and then just say, okay, actually, we don't want you anymore, but that number stays with you. So that, to me, I think is a situation that could come to resolution sooner rather than later. And coming up, we'll continue our Mark Andrews discussion as well as talk about what the Ravens could do with Justin Tucker, because there are worlds where the Ravens could save money by getting rid of him. So be sure to stay tuned. We have a lot coming your way on Locked On Ravens. Back here on Locked On Ravens, Kevin Oestreicher and Brian McFarland, still talking Ravens football, still talking about the Ravens salary cap situation. And Brian, the $11 million for Mark Andrews that the Ravens could save by cutting him, trading him, is, you and I both have said, that's not an insignificant amount of money. But the production that Andrews brings to the table, that is also not insignificant whatsoever. So in your mind, when you're weighing that $11 million, when you're weighing Mark Andrews and his production, probably knowing that either Andrews or likely is not going to be on the roster next season regardless, the Ravens are expected to be really competitive in 2025. I think this is a year. We don't know what John Harbaugh's future holds after next season. There's a lot of question marks at a lot of different places. Do you think that $11 million is worth it for the Ravens to take back whether it be to save them from restructure or maybe go after a surprise player in a trade or free agent to fit them under their cap? Or do you think that it is better for them to go out there with Mark Andrews and likely on the team next year? Andrews walks, let's say, in free agency next year, and they probably would get some level of a comp pick for that. Which one do you think, in your mind, you would do if you were Eric DeCosta?
Yeah, again, the salary cap is a puzzle. So if you're not getting the 11 million savings out of him, where are you getting it? And does that mean restructuring somebody else you might not want to? So that's kind of their balancing act. There's something it just kind of came to my mind. It could be they go to both Likely and Andrews and say, we want an extension. Whoever signs first is going to be the one who stays here for the future. It would be, if they can get an extension with Andrews, if that was the direction, you'd not save the whole 11, but you could save 5, and that might be enough with other moves they're going to make. And then you still would have, to your point, you would have, at least for the next year, you would have Likely and Andrews around, and then you would expect Likely to walk as a free agent next year. So, I guess, that's a possibility there too. Lamar's going to, as you said, Andrews and Lamar have been there together from day one. He's been, they're in tune, so to speak. They seem to know where each other, or Lamar knows where Andrews is going to be. Andrews knows which way to break a route, depending upon where the defender is. So, there's something to be said for that. And, if Lamar goes to the front office and says, you cannot get rid of him, that would weigh heavily in their decision-making. They might still do it because they might say, well, we have to. So that's a possibility that would keep the two of them together, at least for the next year. They could draft another one with one of those 11 picks. They could draft another tight end this year. Obviously, if Andrews is traded or cut, then they certainly probably would for sure. But it would probably be a good idea to get a guy in the building this year to be ready to go next year as the number 2. Because is Kohler going to come back? That's up in the air as well. Does he want to go someplace where he might have a better opportunity? If he's here behind a draft pick, perhaps, or behind either Likely or Andrews, is there someplace he could go where he might have an opportunity to at least compete for a starting job? So, that whole room is going to be interesting the way they handle it. But it is, it's hard to ignore that Likely is that much younger and, seemingly ready to go. And we saw when Andrews, in Kansas City, when Likely, was in that first, the first game of the year, he had an incredible game, and almost even more incredible if they just got that toe in there. So, that's going to be one. Obviously, that's one of the most interesting offseason decisions they have. And, and it's obviously a huge decision.
And I think for multiple different reasons, and it probably does come down to just how much the Ravens trust Isaiah Likely. And I do think they trust him a ton, especially because we've seen over the past few years when Andrews has gone down with injury, Likely stepped into that role, and it pretty much was a seamless transition. But there is the luxury factor of having what I think are 2 top 10 tight ends in the league on the field at the same time, because it is a mismatched nightmare when you also talk about you have to worry about Lamar and Derrick Henry and Zay Flowers and Rashod Bateman. Brian, let's move on to Justin Tucker. Obviously, the situation with him during the season where he struggled during the first part of the year and then kind of brought it back after the bye week and was great. Then, obviously, the allegations have dropped over this past month and more continue to come out. The NFL is going through their investigation. John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta both spoke on the matter and both made it clear that the Ravens are going to be looking at kickers here. They're on their board. They have their draft board, and they're looking at guys with 11 draft picks. You could maybe see the Ravens taking, if it's with one of their day 3 picks, a kicker with one of them. Obviously, depending on how this investigation turns out, what decision the Ravens or the NFL makes with it, that could obviously have an impact, a massive one. But the Ravens could also decide, hey, we don't really want this anymore. It was apparent, and John Harbaugh said that even before everything, it was always going to be a priority to look at the kicker situation, because while Harbaugh said you expect the guy like Tucker to go forever on the field, that just obviously is never the case. Guys do have to retire at some point. So Tucker has an option here, at least for the Ravens and their cap savings, to actually save them money if the Ravens designate him as a post-June 1 cut. I know I've seen you on social media talking about it. Can you kind of outline the cap situation with Justin Tucker and how they would save money in an event they do decide to move on?
Sure. And the only way they can save money is with the post-June 1. Because right now, if they released him today, and I've been saying over and over, they're not going to release him today. They're not going to release him before the 12th, which is the first day of the new league year, if they intend to release him, because actually that would cost him about almost $500,000 more than he costs right now. So his cap number right now is about $7 million. Will cost him about $7.5 million in cap dead money. So anything that would happen there would have to wait till after the 12th, which is the beginning of the new league year. Now, that doesn't mean if they were fully done, they couldn't say right now, just like the Jets did with Aaron Rodgers saying we're moving on. The Ravens could come out and say, well, we're moving, we're going to move on, but for salary cap purposes, we're not going to release him until after the 12th. So, but if they did at whatever point decide to move on, the post-June 1 release does create $4.2 million in cap savings, which is a decent chunk of change. That does put about $4 million in dead money on the 2026 cap. Because you split the dead money. So there's about $7 million in dead money there. So about 4.5 of that would hit the 2026 cap, but that gives them time to, plan around that, so to speak. Plus you get the 4.2 now. You can always set aside some of that to carry over to next year to kind of offset that. So that's certainly, if he is going to be released, it would not be till, and each team has 2 post-June 1 releases. You can release them before June 1. They stay on your cap until June 1, and then you get the cap savings after that. It doesn't help the team any. It actually just helps the player get to free agency sooner, because they are technically a free agent, even though they're sitting on the Ravens cap. They're already going to be doing that with Marcus Williams. They'll do that, I'm sure, on the 5 o'clock on the 12th. The new league year starts at 4. They'll probably they might wait a little longer than that, but they're going to do that pretty quickly. So they do have, and they don't have really any other candidates for that. So if they wanted to use that on Tucker, they could do so. They seem like they want to let the league look into things before they make any decisions. The league isn't going to suspend him until the summer if it happens. So is he going to be on the team through the summer, through OTAs, into training camp? I don't know. If they wait that long, they seemingly are saying they're keeping him and they're going to let the NFL would suspend him for a few games or whatever, and they'll have another kicker in place. Till then, that would surprise me, but they seems to be more the way. I don't know. That's kind of what I took. If they're going to let the NFL take the lead, and they don't have to play a game this week, so it's not really you're not putting him in front of 50, 60, 70,000 fans and on TV out there kicking. So, but if they are going to release in the post-June 1 is definitely the way to do it. And again, that's $4.2 million in savings.
Yeah, and that's essentially, Brian, what I took away from it too. Eric DeCosta saying we'll wait as patiently as we can for as much information as we can, and we'll make our decision based off of that. And Eric DeCosta saying that they're fortunate that the league is doing an investigation. So I think that they'll wait till that turns up anything, or maybe it doesn't. Who knows? I know that the league is in Baltimore talking to some of the women who came forward. So we'll see how it plays out. But definitely seems like the Ravens could spend a day 3 draft pick on a kicker, assuming it all goes that way, or at least if a guy's undrafted, it's a high-profile undrafted kicker, maybe they bring in a guy like that as well. But you talked about extensions. You mentioned Derrick Henry. Seems like a formality at this point that something along those lines is going to happen. Obviously, Henry's on a 1-year deal now, signed a 2-year deal with the Ravens last year. So obviously extensions can alleviate that cap hit, as you've talked about. Feels like Henry might just sign a deal that keeps him in Baltimore for as long as he wants to keep playing. I don't know what that would look like, but I've kind of pinpointed it at least the 1-year deal. Maybe it could be a 2-year extension. I don't know. They would add void years or whatnot to even lessen stuff, but how do you kind of feel like that situation is going to play out?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's, he's made it clear, again, there was a DeCosta again being very, speaking very positively about, wanting him around, and obviously he's under contract for next year anyway. But so, yeah, I think, this deal The base deal just averaged 8 a year. He's outperformed that without a doubt. He seems like obviously a player that don't have to worry about him not coming into camp in shape. And he certainly seems like a unicorn in a way that, he's just not a guy that, seems to be slowing down. And obviously running with Lamar, having Lamar in the backfield with him, makes such a difference. You see what, his numbers from the prior year in Tennessee to what he did here. He's due a raise. I looked at, McCaffrey's contract in San Francisco because he was such catching 100 balls a year. His contract kind of an outlier. That's $19 million a year. Barkley is only at a little over 12. And then Jonathan Taylor's at like 14. So that's kind of the top of the market. They're all younger by 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 years. So I kind of pegged it as a 2-year, 12 million a year. So 2 years, 24 extension. So that would keep him under contract for 3 more years, figuring that I think you can pretty comfortably say he's going to be very good the next 2 years. And then you'll figure out the 3rd year. I kind of played it out with adding a void year just to spread the money out a little bit, not terribly. So that if it got to the 3rd year and at that point it was too much, so to speak, you could move on or his time, you could move on, or he retires, you can move on from him, and the cap, the dead money on the cap at that point wouldn't be terrible. So that gives him, again, that's a $4 million raise on his base deal from last year, puts him up in the upper echelon, and certainly played like an upper echelon running back. So I thought that was a fair deal. He took a pretty decent deal last year. So maybe he's made a lot of money. Maybe he's a guy that says, I just want to stay. Maybe it becomes 11 and not 12, or something like that. Or maybe they can get him for those numbers. And, I think that would make everybody happy. That could save about $5 million on the cap for him. So, that's a place where you can definitely go. And again, this is just another piece of that puzzle of without going too crazy with restructures. Again, extensions will be far better for a lot of these guys than restructures.
Right. And Derrick Henry, super important part to what the Ravens do. And another part of their offense that's hitting free agency might be poised to return. Ronnie Stanley seems like that situation is taking a turn where the Ravens are going to keep him. So be sure to stay tuned here on Locked On Ravens. We'll talk about what it means for the Ravens and what that deal could look like coming up next. Back on Locked On Ravens with Brian McFarland. I am Kevin Oestreicher, talking here on this midweek edition of the show. Brian, Ronnie Stanley's been such an important part of the Ravens offensive line since coming out of Notre Dame in that 2016 class. And obviously it's been an unfortunate ride the last couple of seasons with the injuries, but put together a healthy year last year and played pretty good football overall. I know that there was some iffiness about whether Stanley would come back to Baltimore, but after John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta spoke on Tuesday, really seems like all that doubt is just erased, and the confidence level for Ronnie Stanley being back is through the roof. I mean, Eric DeCosta started off with his confidence saying that, quote, you never want to say 100%, but I feel good that we'll have a healthy debate, a good process. We're going to meet with his agent in Indy this week, and I'm optimistic we'll be able to get the deal done. Then John Harbaugh took it a step further than DeCosta did and just straight up said, I think we'll probably keep Ronnie. Hopefully we will. And to me, it's just like, I think this is a great move for the Ravens if it happens. Obviously, the contract is the big contention point here. I know I've seen projections of him right around 2 years, 20 to 21 million per season, maybe a little higher than that. Do you feel like that's the ballpark the Ravens want to go into? Because you start getting to 3 years, 4 years. Does that get a little more iffy when you talk about the length of the deal? And where's the money range for you that you like?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one because I mean at the end of the season press conference, DeCosta was not very didn't seem very positive. It was kind of the stock answer. We'll take a look, and they always bring the roster in, and we got to make decisions all over the roster. They give it that kind of coach speak, GM speak in this case. So that's why I think I think everybody was kind of shocked that it was, well, I think we're going to get something done, So, so obviously that would lead to believe that they've had some discussions, and I'm just going to speculate that the price point that Stanley's looking for is not as far out as the Ravens had originally thought. He's a tough valuation because of that injury history. He's 31 now. That injury history, it's hard to say, oh gosh, that's we could just ignore that. He obviously played all 17 this year and playoffs, and really, I don't think he missed, other than being pulled at the end of games. I don't think he missed any snaps. I mean, there was one game where like, oh gosh, he went down, and everybody was like, oh, here we go again, and he got up okay and came off the field and came right back on. So yes, I'd seen those projections. I didn't think the Ravens would go to 20 to 21 or any higher than that a year. They know him better than anybody. So, one of my concerns was, we see it with a lot of players that, they're now he was playing for his career. He played this year for his career. And because if he had another year like he had the last couple, he might not even get a contract offer, or it might be just a 1-year prove it deal. $1 million or so with some incentives, maybe, based on playing time. But so, and the Ravens had to factor that in as well. Did he have a career year, so to speak? And obviously not his best year, but of the past 5, and is that based on him, he needed to, and, do they trust that he'll be as dedicated? I'm not saying he's not dedicated, so I don't want to not casting any aspersions, but this is what teams go through when they have to make these decisions. That's got to be in their mind. It's got to be one of the factors they think about. So, I don't know. Now, are we talking 16, 17 million a year? If that's the case, I would think they'll jump on it. Probably for cap purposes, a 4-year deal, and if you get 3 of the 4 out of it, you're happy. They could build some, they did not in this latest deal, but they could build in some roster bonuses based on games played. So it's kind of like incentives, but if you play all 17, you get $1 million, you get 200 or 250 or so, a game, or 200 a game or something like that. So if you're healthy and you're on the game day roster, you get paid. So that lessens the team's exposure. So if you do get hurt, that comes off the cap. So, yeah, I mean, I think that was probably the biggest surprise of the press conferences today, for sure. And part of it may be, I mean, they talked up Rosengarten, but maybe they feel, his future's at right tackle, and they'd like to leave him there, or they like to leave him there for another year or two, and before moving him over to left tackle. So, and part of it's going to be, what does Stanley want to do? If he says, I think I'm going to play for 2 years, then they probably do a 3-year deal, not a 4-year deal. But if he says, I'm going to play as long as I can, obviously we never know what that's going to be, but, then maybe the 4-year deal. But getting him done, getting him done now is better. If he hits the market, it's going to be hard to keep him, unless he has a valuation higher than the Ravens think, which doesn't seem to, be the case based on this press conference. So sounds like they're pretty close.
Yeah, that would be music to my ears, I know, and a lot of other people's ears as well, because you even talk about, Brian, the youth on this offensive line. Stanley's become the veteran leader of that line, because if he leaves, you have Linderbaum, Rosengarten, even if you want to talk about Falele, Voorhees, that's a young room. Stanley has become that veteran leader. And so I think that, if he leaves, they'd probably bring somebody else in, or at least try to. But you're right. The offensive line market, we saw Robert Hunt get $100 million. Damian Lewis got like 63. That market is out of control. So if you can keep your own guys and do it at some level of a discount, I think that works out for the Ravens 100%. For the Ravens, a bunch of uncertain futures, some maybe more uncertain than others, but an interesting offseason ahead nonetheless. Brian, I appreciate you hopping on. Thank you for joining me. Please tell people where they can find you and what you're working on, because I know it's a busy time of year coming up for you.
Yeah, it's my time of year. So anytime news breaks immediately, you'll find me on Twitter/X, trying to break things down as we get as much information as we get as soon as we can, putting that together. Then there'll be articles on Russell Street Report. I'm going to have we talked about what I didn't label it, but effective cap space, that idea that what is really available to spend given the future cost expenses. So that article should hopefully be out in the next day or so. And then obviously when signings happen, we try to break it down as quickly as possible. Signings, cuts, extensions, whatever they may be.
Yeah, Brian does a great job. Be sure to give him a follow on social media. Go read his work. All the links down in the description below. Brian, appreciate you again. And thank you to everybody for watching and listening to Locked On Ravens. Again, we're a 5-day-a-week Ravens podcast. So on the way out, hit that like and subscribe button in video form and follow along in audio form for that 5-day-a-week plus more coverage. Coming up tomorrow, we'll be back here talking more Ravens. Maybe they'll make a move. Maybe they won't. Who knows? The possibilities are endless. Stay tuned. I'll see you right back here tomorrow on Locked On Ravens.